Hello and welcome, it's Francis here. Thank you for coming back to my channel. If this is your first time here, I bid thee welcome. There is a subscribe button and a bell below if you want to be notified as to when I upload more content, and that way you also support my channel. So I'm coming to you from Ghana country. As such, I acknowledge the Ghana people of the Adelaide Plains as being the traditional custodians of this land. So this is the second or third time I've been trying to do this, and I keep ending up in a coughing fit because I have a little tickle in my throat. We've had some really weird weather here in Adelaide of late. Weird as in just unseasonably. Storms, thunderstorms. We've just had another downpour. And this time, it's supposed to be spring coming into summer. And it's just different. So, enough about that. This video may be a little bit controversial, but it's just a few thoughts that have been mulling around in my head again from what I've seen, and so I just thought I would just share it out in YouTube land. So firstly, I just want to state that there is a difference between witch and someone who practices, say, folk magic or herbalism or aromatherapy, crystal healing, energetic healing, etc., etc. However, all these terms and labels can overlap, but there tends to be a tendency these days for people to describe all of the above as witchcraft. And that may not necessarily be the case. Yes, the word witch does imply someone who uses magic, but not all people who use magic are witches. And to use this word as a coverall, I don't know, it's a bit strange, and it can lead to a lot of confusion. We've seen this before, and it's like everything's cycling back again. I've seen this before in the 80s and 90s, where what was once pagan or paganism became to be referred to as Wicca. And the result of that 20 odd years later, 30 years later, is that we have this divide between what people perceive Wicca as, and especially with its connection with Gerald Gardner. Yet what the majority of Wicca that is out there has nothing or very little to do with what Gardner's vision was and what continues to be, even when it's been involved through other traditions of contemporary witchcraft. And this is something that I've talked about before, so I really don't want to repeat myself there. But I suppose the prompt to this video was I was recently watching some online event thing, and one of the presenters said that they came from a long line of witches, generations upon generations upon generations. Now, I don't know what the standard number of years per generation is these days. Should we say 60, 70 years? So we've got a couple of generations, so say 200, 300 years ago. So that would make, what, 17th century? I would actually be very curious as to where they got their facts from. Or I'll be very skeptical, because I am. And I feel I have just cause. Firstly, I don't know why people need to big note themselves. I come from a long line of witches. Does that give you any more brownie points? It's like people saying, and I know people do this, say, oh, I'm initiated, so I know everything. It's just like, no, you don't. We all know everything. We just know different parts of everything, because no one can know the complete everything. Otherwise, we wouldn't be here. Our little human minds would explode. We couldn't cope with the everything. We only know what we know, and we see everything through filters and what have you. So there's no way we can know everything. And if we knew everything and we didn't explode, we would be very humble, because you find that the more spiritually aligned people, the humbler they are. Is that a word? Anyway, I'm getting off the track. Generations upon generations upon generations, a long line of witches. Yes, I disagree. And the reason I would disagree was that back then, depending on how many generations were going back, say 3, 4, 5 generations, people simply didn't call themselves witches. End of story. It wasn't until very recently, and we tend to forget this. I think the last person, I know people are still being accused and hung, tortured, jailed for witchcraft today in certain parts of the world. But say in our English-speaking world, largely the last person who was actively tried for witchcraft was Helen Duncan. Back in the 40s, she was a British medium. I won't go into all that. You can easily Google her story. But it was the outrage throughout her community, the mediumship community, that she was associated with witchcraft, which was then still being perceived as in a negative framework, that this led to the British Witchcraft Act being repealed in 51 or 54, must be 51, and love him or hate him, the very first person who publicly called himself a witch in our modern era was Gerald Gardner. Not saying he was the only witch. He never actually stated that. People get their knickers in a knot all over the place as soon as you mention Gerald's name. He never claimed he was the only witch. He was the first person, however, to put on public record that he was a witch. And that actually, him doing that actually upset the coven that he was working with. Yes, he may have pipped other people at the post as well. But after he made this public disclosure, other people did come forward and say, oh yeah, we're witches too. Before then, and this goes back to the generations upon generations claim, witchcraft was still seen through the medieval Catholic or Christian viewpoint or lens as being diabolical, as being associated with devil worship, negative magics, but where witches would only focus on harm and, blighting crops and causing miscarriages in animals and humans and whole kit and caboodle. Those were what was termed as witches. There were folk healers, folk magicians, herbalists, your cunning man, your wise woman, especially those who practiced with herbs. And yes, the herbs could cure or not cure. But these were sort of the forerunners more to our medical profession, and weren't necessarily witches. We're at an era where to be disclosed as a witch, to be called as a witch, to be outed as a witch, you would be hung or tortured or drowned or tied to a stake and burnt. And that continued till the 17th century, so fairly recently. So you weren't running around calling yourself a witch. You're calling yourself anything but. And also that whole mindset was that this is what the word witch conjured up, these images. Even folk magic practitioners, not say disguised, but classified what they did as something completely different. We might see it today as similar to witchcraft, so we call it witchcraft. But I would doubt very much that generations and generations again, your ancestors or my ancestors, should they have been doing folk magic or herbalism or whatever, actually publicly call themselves witches due to this association of it being diabolical. And what I do find interesting is that depending on the era, the majority of, well, not say the majority, but there is a heightened amount of magic or magical workings actually to protect people from witches, from night tremors, from night visitors. Even like for America, all the hex symbols from the Pennsylvanian Dutch people, that's all a protection against witchcraft. The evil eye, the Hasmahan, again, protection against witchcraft, or what in their language we would identify with as witchcraft. And this is the interesting thing. Language is living. Language does merge and move and can be shaped and twisted. And there are words that are very similar to describe a practice. And we see that even today, say like in Italy, we have the word strega. Well, it's probably pronounced a little bit different from the Italian. But that is a very similar practice that those of us of English descent, and this is where the word witch originated from, would say, oh yeah, very similar practices. Strega, therefore, is witchcraft. Now, would the strega call themselves witches? I don't know if what strega actually directly translate into English, if it actually directly translates as witch or something very similar. You also see it in, say, in Central America. We've got lots of the folk healing traditions there, and moving up into lower areas of America, the United States, where you've still got the hoodoo voodoo, sort of all the conjuring folk people there. Yes, they use magic, but are they witches? Would that be an insult? So we're using witchcraft now as an umbrella term to describe similar practices, which are actually individual practices in their own right. So we're painting everything with the same brush, and I think this is what leads to the confusion. As we said, a good example of that is this word Wicca, and we get people virtually internally combusting these days. When you mention, well, especially if you mention contemporary witchcraft or initiatory witchcraft, because they see that as Wicca, i.e. as in the sort of new agey, Scott Cunningham, light and fluffing, dancing around the fairies style of witchcraft or Wicca. There was also, this goes back a number of years, probably about 10, 15 years ago, before Facebook, when we were still on the Google groups, Yahoo groups, if anybody can remember them, maybe I'm just showing my age, where I came across Wiccans who actually didn't do magic, which I felt weird. So why don't you do magic? Or what do you actually do? Oh, we just, follow the wheel of the year and the moons. Okay, that's fine. That's their practice. That's their interpretation of Wicca. However, it's completely alien to what I do. I did call myself Wiccan for a while because that was a nice, safe word, especially in the 80s, 90s, 2000s. Now everybody's running around calling themselves a witch. I'm looking for a different term. But yeah, I'm getting off track and don't know why I bother writing notes, because I don't stick to them. So witchcraft, we all know, means the practice or the craft of the witch. But then, what is the witch? And what justifies a witch? Just because you do magic, or you're following a folk magic or a conjuring tradition or practice, it's because you are manifesting at the moon or whatever, is that actually witchcraft? Am I making a mountain out of a molehill? I said language is very interesting, and it's also very important, because after all, it's language that we use when we cast our spells, we do our petitions, even when we do our witchcraft and our affirmations, we are all using language. So it's like, how do we perceive things? And I'm not saying that you don't have the right to use witchcraft or the word witch if you do folk magic. As I said, the words, there's lots of blending. It's like, sometimes we need to think as to what justifies that concept. Especially if we're going to big note ourselves and said, oh yes, my grandmother, read tea leaves, so she was a witch. Well, my grandmother did read tea leaves, okay, not publicly, but she did read tea leaves. She also hosed down Jehovah's Witnesses as well. But she wasn't a witch. She comes from an era of people, and they were highly superstitious at that era and time. We actually, I think, buried her as an Anglican, even though I never saw her step foot in church. But she definitely would not call herself a witch. And I think this is where we are almost taking liberty, especially those of us who, and I'm using this term generally, who do ancestor veneration. Your ancestors might have done the folk magic, but their folk magic might have been to protect them from what they classified as witches. So you, 200 years later, calling them a witch is highly offensive to them. It lacks respect. Call themselves a folk magic practitioner, but don't call them a witch. Why do you need to? And I think this is the other thing. Why do you need to sort of validate your own practice today? I'm thinking back through my family line, and I am the first one to call myself a witch. Said my grandmother read tea leaves. Before then, I don't know much about the family line. There would have been herbalists and whatevers, because if you go back generations, that's what they had. Also being country folk, that's what they did. Or the folk charms and things like that. But they did not call themselves witches. So I think, especially if you are into ancestor veneration, maybe you just want to consider how appropriate it is to refer to an ancestor as a witch if their magic was actually to protect them from witchcraft. As I said, I find this all interesting. That we're needing to, if anything, I suppose, justify ourselves, which in turn questions our own ability as to what you're doing. I might end it there. Something to think about. That's it.